tuned for a wild ride as we talk about the very borders of physics, chemistry, information theory, mathematics. With us today is Professor Paul Davies. He's a theoretical physicist, cosmologist, and broadcaster, best-selling author of more than 20 books on science, winner of the Templeton Prize, and he's the director of the Beyond Center for Fundamental Concepts in Science at Arizona State University. And we're going to be talking about his latest book, The Demon in the Machine, How Hidden Webs of Information Are Solving the Mystery of Life. Well, let's begin with the discussion of your book, The Demon in the Machine, but also your path that led you to this point, starting in childhood. So when you were a child, what was it like? What steered you in the direction of science?
You know, people often ask me that, and the short answer is I grew up in post-war London, which was a period of great austerity, and so we didn't have all the fancy little gizmos and amusements that young people have today. We had to make our own entertainment, and for me it was just a matter of stepping outside and looking up. And there was a wonderland above my head that most people never noticed. I'd talk about the stars and shooting stars and the planets and things like that. And I became sort of lost in a world of exotic things seen and even more exotic things unseen. I read about atoms and subatomic particles and was fascinated by invisible forces like magnetic fields, and all of this gripped my imagination under the age of 10, I might say. So from the earliest I can remember, I really was fascinated by science and resolved to make a career in science, and I've done just that. I've followed my dream.
Okay, now your book, The Demon in the Machine, tries to answer the question, one of the greatest questions in all of science, what is life? So how did you, as a physicist, get interested in solving this fundamental question, what is life?
One of the world's most famous physicists, Erwin Schrödinger, the founder of quantum mechanics, the most successful scientific theory ever, he did this in the 1920s, turned his attention to the problem of the physics of life during the midst of World War II, which was an extraordinary thing. He went to Dublin in Ireland during those war years, and Ireland was neutral, and he was able to indulge his interest in this crossover between physics and biology, because on the one hand, it's pretty clear physics deals with things like atoms, simple things at the bottom level. Biology deals with this complex, amazing, bizarre thing we call life, which looks like magic. And so somehow between atom and organism, magic comes in, and he wanted to know what was the source of that magic. He didn't get very far. He wrote a famous book called What is Life, published in 1944, 75 years ago, and I'm taking up where Schrödinger left off. I read that book when I was a student, and I was deeply intrigued, thinking, well, yes, you know, living organisms are made of perfectly ordinary matter. There's nothing special about the atoms in our body, but put it together, and it does something truly remarkable. I want to know how that magic emerges. I've always wanted to know that, and I think we're beginning to glimpse the answer.
Okay, well, there were also two other young scientists who read that book, What is Life, by Erwin Schrödinger. We had James Watson and Francis Crick, winners of the Nobel Prize for isolating the molecule that contained the code of life. Now, in the book, I understand, Schrödinger said that there must be a molecule of some sort out there which contains a code, the code of life. And this is how Darwin's theory of evolution works, by mutations in that code. And so didn't their work eventually lead to the unraveling of the DNA molecule?
That's exactly right. Schrödinger himself didn't name DNA, but he did say there would be a molecule. He called it, curiously, an aperiodic crystal. What he meant by that was that this should not be like an ordinary crystal, because that just is a boring repeating structure. It can't encode much information, but it should have a molecule with the stability of a crystal. So this is something that could encode the information, vast amounts of information. I think today we all know that DNA is like the blueprint or the instruction manual for life, for building life. It's chock full of information. But what many people don't realize is it doesn't stop with DNA. We talk about genes as carrying information about hair color or eye color or something like that. But genes don't act in isolation. They form complex networks, and information flows around those networks. The genes can switch each other on and off. There are complex patterns of information pulsing around within the cells and between cells, signals between individual cells and between organs and between entire organisms. So the biological world is just full of information, webs of information, all the way from DNA right up to the whole planet, the entire ecosystem of the planet. I like to say that the biosphere is the original World Wide Web.
Now, some people say that that's just the beginning, because just to say that life is a code, and the code is encoded in a molecule, doesn't tell you, well, where did it come from? Was it purely random phenomenon that gave rise to this? I mean, what does it all mean? Where did it all come from? What are your thoughts?
In spite of decades of progress in biology, nobody can say how life began. Nobody can say what life is. It is a huge mystery as to how a mishmash of chemicals somehow transform themselves into this magical thing we call life. Now, there are lots of ideas about the first building blocks of life, but I'm not very impressed by this work, because it's a little bit like coming across New York City and saying, well, it's all amazing, how did this come to exist? And then after many years of work, announcing in triumph, well, we figured out how to make a brick, so it's just a matter of more of the same. We know that's not true. It's not the building blocks that count, it's how they're put together into the elaborate and complex, and most importantly for me, information processing structures. So the shorthand way of saying that is that life has hardware which is perfectly straightforward. Atoms of the same that we see in non-living systems. It's not the hardware that counts, it's the software. It's the information processing and storage capabilities. That's what defines life.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Perhaps one of the greatest mysteries in all of science is the question of life. What is life? Where did it come from? Where is it going? With us today is physicist Paul Davies, author of an exciting new book, The Demon in the Machine, How Hidden Webs of Information Are Solving the Mystery of Life. And he says that at the very center of the mystery of life is information. This is a new tack that scientists have not pursued very much. The question of what links biology, chemistry, physics, information theory, what links it all together, he says, is information theory. Now, we talked about Erwin Schrödinger, the man who helped to unravel the secret of quantum mechanics, which then led Crick and Watson to discover the DNA molecule. But you claim that behind all of this is information theory. And the man behind information theory was Turing, Alan Turing. So could you explain now where computers and Alan Turing's work comes into play?
This is the most fascinating aspect of my voyage of discovery into the nature of living matter, because it is really where these different subject areas like computing, physics, and chemistry, and information theory merge together. When you look back at the history of this, Alan Turing, I think, is well known to people these days as the man who broke the German U-boat Enigma code and possibly shortens World War II by many months, maybe even a year or two. Immensely significant work. And so he's known for his code-breaking capabilities, but he was famous as a mathematician before that, back in the early 1930s, because he came up with the concept that we would now call the computer. That is a universal programmable computer. And he came at this in a very abstract way by considering about under what circumstances can numbers be computed. That you might think that you could ask a question in fundamental mathematics. Let me just give you a very simple example. 11 is a prime number, true or false? You think, well, in that case, we know that's true. You think, is it possible that any mathematical statement of that sort would have a definite answer, true or false? Well, it was already known from the work of the Austrian logician Kurt Gödel, also in the 1930s, that wasn't always the case, that there are propositions which are undecidable. We simply cannot say true or false. Turing took that and turned it into practical mathematics, and he came up with the notion of what we would now call the computer, which is something which would return an answer. Could a number be computed, yes or no? And it turns out most numbers are actually uncomputable. So this was how he got into it, and this led to the notion of a universal computer, a computer that could compute any number that was computable, a universal computer, what we now call the computer, or sometimes called the Turing machine. And this connects very much with life, because on the other side of the Atlantic, John von Neumann was also working during the war years on the notion of universal computer. And he was interested, both Turing and von Neumann were interested in biology, because in a sense, a living organism is like a universal constructor. If you think about DNA, it's got instructions to make proteins, for example, and it can make, you can program it to make any protein that you like. You could edit those genes to make whatever protein you wanted, and it also replicates itself. So here we have a universal constructor, which is also a universal replicator. When you think about it, the rules for universal construction and universal computation are very, very close. Logically, they're very similar things. So here we see the merging of the foundations of computing and logic and biology and self-replicating machines. A whole bunch of subjects which are now of immense importance at the forefront of science coming together in the 30s and 40s in the shadow of a world war.
And you also go on to say that at the crux of chemistry, physics, mathematics, biology is information theory. So explain to us, what is information theory? Why does it underlie the internet, computers, everything around us? And not only that, but life itself, you say, can be viewed through the lens of information theory. So what is information theory?
Well, here we have yet another component of World War II science. So the problem, I think, is obvious to everybody. If you're trying to give a command or an instruction down a noisy telephone line, a crackly radio channel, there's always a problem about, will the information get through or will the message be garbled? And so a man called Claude Shannon was engaged by the U.S. military to work out the optimal way of encoding that information so there was the least chance of the message getting garbled or misunderstood. So he sat down to develop a formal theory of information and channels of information and information transfer and the optimal encoding. And now, when you think about a living organism, take DNA, this is a repository of information. It's got the database which is necessary to build the organism. If a gene is expressed, that means that there's some machinery in the cell that creates a protein according to the orders in that gene. And this is a flow of information from the gene through this complicated channel, this chemical system, to the protein that makes it. So we see a direct comparison with information going down a noisy telephone line and information flowing from DNA into proteins. And by extension, we see within living organisms information flowing everywhere. The most conspicuous example is, of course, between your ears, that great information processor that we call the brain. But there are many, many examples of information organized in living systems. And so the essence of life is really the way chemistry has harnessed information transfer, storage, and processing to carry out what we might think of as an agenda. Living organisms seem to have goals or purposes. They have an agenda, and that agenda is implemented through the manipulation of information. Chemistry is important, of course, in biology, but it's really the information flow, the patterns of information that gives living organisms their key features. So to understand it, we have to understand information theory, but that's the link that joins the world of physics and mathematics with the world of biology, with the world of life.
Now, in your book, you say this is not just an academic exercise in mathematics. No, we're talking about real-life applications. For example, cancer. For example, consciousness, life in outer space. So tell us how your theory sheds light on these subjects, cancer, life in outer space, and how it has practical applications.
Well, the easy one is life in outer space, because I think a lot of people feel that the universe should be teeming with life, but that's only the case if on an Earth-like planet, non-life turns into life with relative ease. That is to say that chemicals can become life just over a few million years. Now, we don't know that. We have no idea how life formed. If we want to understand the transition from non-life to life, we have to understand how this software of life I've been talking about comes into existence. So if we understand fully what it takes to turn non-life into life, we can answer that question: are we alone in the universe? If it turns out that that transition is relatively easy and we can replicate it in the lab, we can be pretty sure that the universe is teeming with life. But if it turns out that getting the software of life out of hardware, getting molecules to write their own code, if you like, if that step is a remarkably peculiar one, then it may well be that life is restricted to Earth. So there's that obvious application. When it comes to cancer, that's more of a practical thing. The way that cancer is characterized, there are a number of so-called...
Okay, let's take another short commercial break. And once again, you're listening to Professor Paul Davies. The book is called The Demon in the Machine. With Professor Michio Kaku. With us today is Professor Paul Davies, theoretical physicist, cosmologist, broadcaster, winner of the Templeton Prize, and professor of physics at Arizona State University, and author of a new book, The Demon in the Machine. And we're talking about the origin of life, one of the greatest questions at the intersection of chemistry, physics, biology, and he claims that it is information theory that will help to unravel all the mysteries about life. Well, Paul, let me ask you a question that's been bothering me all these years. We know that all life on Earth can be traced to one molecule, just one molecule, called the DNA, rearranged in different ways. But the question is, if it happened once, how come it didn't happen twice? 3 times? Was it just one molecule over 3.5 billion years? There should be other molecules that were also capable of self-replication, but we don't see them. We just see the same molecule rearranged in different ways. Any thoughts?
Well, the first thing I should say is that you're absolutely right. If you take the informational view of life, as I do, the software view, then there's no particular reason to be wedded to this molecule called DNA. It's a little bit like if you've got a file on your computer, maybe you use a PC, but you can download that file and transfer it to a Mac, or you could put it down an optical fiber, or you could store it in some totally different medium entirely. The message stays the same. The information content is the same. It's where the technical term is it's independent of the substrate, the actual stuff in which it's instantiated. And so if you believe that life is really all about patterns of information, then it can be instantiated in many, many different forms. So there's no particular reason it has to be DNA. Now, DNA turns out to be a pretty good molecule to do the job, but we have no idea whether it's the only molecule. It would be surprising if it is. Now, your question is, why do we see only one form of life on Earth? And it's true that all life on Earth so far studied is the same life. It's using this same molecule, DNA, and a whole bunch of other molecules, I might say, which are the same. And in particular, it uses the same genetic code because DNA has often said 4 letters. It's really 4 molecules in which that information is encoded. And so it's like a 4-letter alphabet, but DNA, the genes in DNA code for proteins, which do a lot of the work in life, and proteins use an alphabet of 20 different symbols or different molecules called amino acids. So you've got a 4-letter alphabet encoding for a 20-letter alphabet, and there is a mathematical table that connects if you like, DNA speak with the protein speak, the 4-letter alphabet with the 20-letter alphabet. That code is universal across all known life on Earth. So this suggests a common origin. It suggests that all life that we have so far studied is the same life descending from a common ancestor. But, and there's a huge but here, we don't know that all life on Earth is the same life. All we know is that all the life we've so far studied. Now, almost all life on Earth is microbes, microbial, bacteria, for example, and archaea, and you can't tell by looking what makes them tick. You've got to delve into their biochemical innards.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Today we're talking about one of the greatest mysteries in all of science. What is life? We know a lot about how life is put together, how it functions, how it operates, but where did it come from? Are other alternative forms of life possible? With us today is Professor Paul Davies, author of a new book, The Demon in the Machine: How Hidden Webs of Information Are Solving the Mystery of Life, and he claims that information theory stands at the center of the debate. It links together chemistry, physics, biology into one grand fabric. Well, before I ask you a question about cancer, you said that your theory has practical applications and sheds light on different mysteries about nature. So tell us a little bit about your theory of cancer.
So I've been studying cancer for about 10 or 15 years. The National Cancer Institute asked me to do this, and so they were hoping that insights from physical science might shed new light on cancer. And it's most cancer biologists like to characterize cancer in terms of what they call certain hallmarks. I think many of these are familiar. For example, cancer switches off the mechanism that tells cells that they have to, in effect, commit suicide when they're past their use-by date or when they're damaged. It's called apoptosis. That gets disconnected. Cancer cells spread around the body. They migrate through the bloodstream, for example, and colonize remote organs. They do these weird things, and there are about 10 of these so-called hallmarks, but these are all physical processes. Now, what we've been trying to do is to characterize cancer in terms of its informational properties, because what goes wrong in cancer, you will see within the cancer cells that the patterns of information flow are disrupted, maybe by mutation, maybe self-inflicted. Maybe the cell is feeling under threat and it switches some genes on and other genes off, changes those patterns. So there will be, in addition to the physical hallmarks of cancer, there will be informational hallmarks. And I have this dream, we're a long way from it yet, that you could fix cancer a little bit like you'd fix a bug in software. Supposing you've got a computer game, your favorite computer game, something like that, or Photoshop or whatever it is, and it won't boot up properly. It's got some sort of bug in it. And you can, as we know, you can just download some new software or a patch or something like that, and you can reboot the system and it can work. And so we're working on the idea that it's the information motifs and patterns that have got out of kilter in cancer, and that we would like to find a way to reboot it rather than just annihilate it, which is the current standard of care.
Okay. Now, let me ask you a question coming from quantum physics, because you're an expert in that field. Roger Penrose, a famous physicist at Oxford University, has said that one day artificial intelligence will never be able to duplicate the human brain because the human brain is quantum mechanical. And simply using transistors and circuits, you'll never be able to duplicate the brain, which he says is quantum mechanical. So what does he mean by that, and how has that theory held up with time?
Well, we started this discussion by talking about Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, and how important that was in gaining insights into the nature of life. But whether quantum mechanics plays a significant role, other than giving us the rules of chemistry, whether it plays a significant role in life is still very contentious. There clearly are some places where quantum mechanics makes a difference. And one case that a lot of people talk about is the way some birds are able to sense the Earth's magnetic field and navigate. That seems to be some sort of quantum process going on. But when it comes to the brain as a whole, that's much more contentious. Is the brain using some sort of quantum trickery to affect its wonderful properties? Is consciousness somehow fundamentally associated with this thing called quantum mechanics? I'm open-minded, but I have to say pretty skeptical. The thing about quantum systems is that they deal only with very small molecules.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. With us today is Professor of Theoretical Physics Paul Davies, author of a new book, The Demon in the Machine. And we're talking about the demon that makes life itself possible. And he thinks that at the center of chemistry, biology, and physics is information theory. And there's a new theory just waiting to be discovered, which ties it all together and gives us the answer to the question, what is life? However, you've also in the book asked a question about, well, free will and determinism. For example, on this show, we've had a number of people building robots, and they pretty much say that a robot has no free will. It does what you tell it to do. It's not responsible for any actions that it makes. It's a robot. And then the question is, if our brain can one day be simulated by transistors, then our brain is deterministic. That is, everything is determined ahead of time. There's no free will. If you commit a murder, it's not because of free will. No, it was preordained by the circuits in your brain that you would commit murder. Now, other people say, no, there is free will in the form of quantum mechanics. That is uncertainty. Roger Penrose, professor of physics at Oxford University, says there should be something quantum mechanical about the brain. Otherwise, we're robots. Otherwise, there's no free will at all. So here's a question for you. Do you think that we have free will? That is, if you commit a murder, was it preordained by your biology that you would commit a murder? Or is it an accident? Or, well, what are your thoughts about free will, determinism? Because it goes to the heart of whether or not we are robots.
You're absolutely right, and these are weighty questions, and I think my short answer is that I believe yes and no. That is to say, a great deal of what we do is in some sense preordained. That is to say, we will often act according to our nature, but that doesn't mean that we can't change that nature. And I think the key thing here is not quantum mechanics, it's the fact that the brain is an open system. Information flows in and out, and matter flows in and out. This argument about determinism, which we better remind our listeners that if you go back to the laws of Isaac Newton, it suggests that if you know the position and motion of every particle in the universe, then everything that ever happens is fixed according to mathematical law. So that would seem to leave no room for freedom. But that's applying it to the universe as a whole. If we take something like the human brain, then it's an open system with information flowing in and out of its environment, and even if I told you the exact physical state of your brain at any given time, I could not predict what you would do 1 second later, for the simple reason that there's information coming in, information going out. I'd have to know the whole universe. And so that's a very hypothetical, a sort of reductio ad absurdum of the entire argument, to say, well, if you knew everything in the universe, you would have no free will. But that nobody could ever test that. That's, I think, a quite ridiculous argument. So I think, yes, we do have an element of free will.
Well, Einstein was famously asked about free will, and he said that, well, yeah, a murderer, in some sense, is not really responsible for the fact that he committed a murder because he was preordained. However, he does not want to have tea with a murderer. Murderers should be put in jail because they're dangerous, but not because they free-willed it, not because they are evil, because he thought everything was preordained by the laws of Isaac Newton. Well, now we have quantum mechanics, which gives us uncertainty, and, people like Roger Penrose think that somewhere in the brain there should be quantum uncertainty. But on this program, we've had some people who believe in artificial intelligence, and they believe that one day every single neuron of our brain will be duplicated by a transistor. Now, if our brain can be duplicated by a mass of billions and billions of transistors, then there's no free will at all. Sort of what Einstein said, that he does not want to have tea with a murderer, though murderers are not really responsible for committing murders. But what are your private thoughts about this question?
Well, Einstein, of course, never believed quantum mechanics. He thought that the world was fundamentally deterministic, right down at the bottom level. Very few scientists now believe that. But I don't think quantum mechanics is the answer either, because quantum mechanics gives you indeterminism, and you don't want that. You want your will to determine your actions. You don't want to be in a situation with quantum uncertainty that I want to raise my arm but my foot goes up instead. That's not free will. So we need some sort of middle position, and I don't think we've completely worked it out. But it's very clear that a lot of what we do, in a sense, we can't help it. And so you're raising the moral questions about criminal justice. My feeling is you might need to lock people up for their own safety and the safety of other people. But as retribution, I think that is the wrong way to go. I don't believe in retributive justice. I just think that people's nature is in very large part already determined by their genetics and their environment and upbringing, and we have to take that into account when we are deciding what to do with criminals.
And in your book, you talk about consciousness, and on Science Fantastic, we've had a number of artificial intelligence people who say that one day we'll be able to work out the mechanics of the brain, but there's something called qualia. And qualia is a very ephemeral concept, the concept that one day robots will not be able to explain the color red, or robots will not be able to understand the beauty of a sunset. Things that are subjective and emotional, robots will never be able to explain. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Once again, our special guest today has been Professor Paul Davies, author of an exciting new book, The Demon in the Machine, which tries to answer the question, what is life? It talks about the hidden webs of information that are solving the mystery of life.